March 23, 1945. Somewhere between the Rhine River and the processing cages of Third Army's prisoner of war holding area, Bad Kreuznach, Germany. The German soldiers had stopped eating, not one man. Not a single act of protest from a broken individual. 312 SS prisoners, captured in the collapse of the Rhine defensive line over the previous 4 days, had collectively refused American rations. The camp commander reported the situation to Third Army headquarters at 0800 hours. The report used careful, neutral language. It described the refusal as a coordinated act of non-compliance. It recommended further negotiation with prisoner leadership to resolve the standoff. The report reached General George S. Patton's desk by 0900. He read it once, set it down. Read it again. Then he asked one question. How long had these men been refusing food? 48 hours, his aide told him. Patton nodded slowly. He picked up a pen, wrote 4 words at the bottom of the report, and handed it back. Those 4 words, precise, cold, and completely legal under the Geneva Convention, would force a choice on 312 German SS soldiers that none of them had anticipated, and every single one of them ate by sundown. To understand what Patton wrote on that report, you must understand the strategic moment in which he wrote it. By March 1945, the German army in the West had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. The crossing of the Rhine at Remagen on March 7th by the U.S. First Army had shattered the last meaningful defensive barrier west of Berlin. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who had replaced von Rundstedt as Commander-in-Chief West on March 10th, reported to Oberkommando der Wehrmacht on March 19th that his forces were incapable of sustained resistance. He used the word dissolution, not retreat, not tactical withdrawal, dissolution. Third Army had crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim on the night of March 22nd and 23rd, meeting resistance that Patton himself described in his diary as remarkably light. German prisoners were flooding the Allied cages at a rate that overwhelmed processing capacity. Between March 15th and March 31st, Third Army alone captured 68,000 German soldiers. The logistics of feeding, housing, and processing that many prisoners in 3 weeks were staggering. Into this context walked the 312 SS men of the Bad Kreuznach standoff. They were not ordinary prisoners. They were Waffen-SS, trained in an ideology that regarded surrender itself as dishonor. Their refusal to eat American food was not hunger strike as protest. It was theater. A performance of defiance for their own morale. A last assertion of identity in a war they had already lost. Patton understood theater. He understood it better than they did. The camp commander's recommendation for further negotiation was the wrong instinct, and Patton knew it immediately. Negotiating with prisoners over whether they would accept standard rations was not a humanitarian act. It was a command failure. It established a precedent that defiance produced accommodation, the single most dangerous precedent possible in a prisoner of war environment holding tens of thousands of men from a military culture that still believed, in March 1945, that the war was not finished. The SS prisoners were watching. Not just the 312 in the Bad Kreuznach cage. Every prisoner in that system was watching what the Americans did when defied. Every camp commander in Third Army's prisoner network would take his behavioral cue from this moment. Patton understood one more thing that the camp commander's report missed entirely. The SS men were not refusing food because they weren't hungry. 48 hours without rations, combined with the physical exhaustion of combat and capture, meant every one of those 312 men was running on empty. Their bodies were past the point of comfortable defiance. The refusal was ideological. The hunger was biological. And in Patton's reading of human nature, shaped by 30 years of military command, biology always won. The question was not how to negotiate. The question was how to make biology win faster, without violating the Geneva Convention's provisions for prisoner treatment, and without handing the SS prisoners the one thing they most wanted, the appearance that their defiance had meant something. Patton's 4 words gave them none of that. What they gave them instead was a choice. and no way to refuse it without defeating themselves. The 4 words Patton wrote at the bottom of the camp commander's report were these: "Then don't feed them." Not a withdrawal of rations, not a punishment. A statement of operational logic that was, in its precision, almost elegant. The Geneva Convention of 1929, which governed the treatment of prisoners of war, required that captors provide adequate food to prisoners. It did not require that captors force prisoners to eat it. The distinction was exact, and Patton had seen it immediately. The rations would remain available 3 times a day. Standard issue. Set in front of every man. If the prisoners chose not to eat, that was a choice they were making. The Americans were compliant with their treaty obligations. The SS men were denying themselves food, while American soldiers placed it within arm's reach. The camp commander received the 4-word instruction at 10:30 hours. He implemented it at the noon meal. What followed over the next 6 hours was a study in the collision between ideology and physiology. The SS prisoners had organized themselves with characteristic efficiency. A senior NCO, Hauptsturmführer Erich Brenner, identified in Third Army's prisoner records by name and rank, had coordinated the refusal, moving through the cage to enforce compliance from men who might otherwise have quietly accepted the rations. Brenner was 41 years old, Eastern Front veteran, holder of the Iron Cross First Class. He had survived Kursk. He had survived the retreat through Ukraine. He understood military discipline in its most demanding form. But Kursk had been fought by men who ate. At the 1200 meal service, the rations appeared. American military field rations in March 1945 included canned meat, hardtack biscuits, powdered coffee, and, critically, chocolate. Not luxury chocolate. C-ration chocolate, dense and calorie-rich, specifically engineered to be unpleasant enough that soldiers would not eat it recreationally, but sustaining enough to maintain combat effectiveness. It sat on the serving tables inside the cage. 312 men looked at it and looked away. By 1400 hours, the first prisoner had broken. He was not one of Brenner's enforcers. He was a 19-year-old Sturmman, a private from Hamburg, identified in Third Army records only by his prisoner number. He had been in the SS for 11 months. He had joined at 17, processed through the replacement system, and arrived at the front in November 1944, in time for the Ardennes offensive. He had been in combat for 4 months. He had not eaten in 50 hours. He picked up a biscuit and ate it. Brenner saw it. By every account reconstructed from prisoner interviews conducted by U.S. Army intelligence officers in April 1945, Brenner moved toward the young soldier. He did not reach him. 3 other prisoners stepped between them, not in protest of Brenner's authority. In exhaustion, they sat down and ate. The cascade that followed was not dramatic. It was quiet and relentless, the way biological necessity always defeats ideological conviction when the two are placed in direct competition long enough. By 1500 hours, half the cage was eating. By 1700 hours, all but 11 men had accepted rations. By sundown, 1823 hours on March 23rd, the last 11 men were eating. Brenner ate last. The American guard who recorded the moment wrote in his log, "Final prisoner accepted ration at 1823. No incident. No incident." 312 men who had been performing defiance for 48 hours, sustained by the social pressure of collective theater, collapsed within 6 hours when an American general declined to give their performance an audience. Patton had not argued with them. He had not threatened them. He had not violated a single provision of international law. He had simply stopped watching. And the moment the performance had no audience, it had no purpose. And the moment it had no purpose, biology took over. The Bad Kreuznach incident was not an isolated moment. It was the crystallization of a command philosophy that Patton had been applying to prisoner management throughout the entire Third Army campaign. His approach produced measurable results. Between August 1944 and May 1945, Third Army processed 956,000 German prisoners. the largest single prisoner intake of any American field army in the European theater. The incident rate in Third Army's prisoner cages, defined as organized resistance, violence, attempted mass escape, or collective non-compliance, was lower than in any comparable holding system. First Army's prisoner cages recorded 47 formal incidents requiring armed intervention between September 1944 and May 1945. Third Army recorded 11. The difference was not brutality. Patton's prisoner administration was, by the documented record, compliant with Geneva Convention standards and, in several respects, more efficiently organized than comparable systems. The difference was command clarity. Patton's orders on prisoner management communicated a single principle. Compliance was expected, non-compliance produced no reward, and every prisoner was subject to the same standard, regardless of unit, rank, or ideology. The SS prisoners understood one language: hierarchy and consequence. Patton spoke it fluently. But here is the counterintuitive truth that the Bad Kreuznach incident reveals. The truth that runs against everything the conventional narrative of prisoner management assumes. The toughest response to the food refusal was also the kindest. 48 hours of hunger had already weakened the prisoners beyond what another 48 hours would have served. Patton's 4-word instruction ended the standoff in 6 hours. A negotiated approach, the approach the camp commander had recommended, might have extended it for days, deepening the prisoners' physical deterioration while giving their defiance a legitimacy it had not earned. The hardness was the mercy. Erich Brenner, the Hauptsturmführer who had organized the refusal, was interviewed by U.S. Army intelligence on April 7, 1945, 2 weeks after the incident. The interviewing officer asked him directly why the refusal had collapsed. Brenner's answer, translated and recorded in the intelligence file, was precise. "We expected them to try to make us eat. We were prepared for that. We were not prepared for them not to care. They were not prepared for not being watched." That was Patton's insight. Not tactical, not operational. Psychological. The SS soldier's identity required an enemy engaged in active opposition. Defiance only functions against a wall that pushes back. When the wall simply stepped aside, the defiance had nowhere to go. It fell into the space where it had been directed and collapsed under its own weight. 312 men, 6 hours. 4 words. The military record provides 4 distinct layers of confirmation for what Patton understood about command, compliance, and human nature. The first is operational. Third Army's prisoner management produced a 956,000 prisoner intake, with 11 formal incidents requiring armed intervention. The ratio, 1 incident per 86,909 prisoners, is a logistical achievement that the U.S. Army's own post-war analysis, conducted in 1947 by the Army Ground Forces Board, rated as exceptional by any comparative measure. The report specifically credited Third Army's command climate and clarity of standard as primary factors. The second is statistical. The 6-hour collapse of the Bad Kreuznach food refusal against an expected duration, based on comparable incidents in other holding systems, of 72 to 96 hours, represents a reduction of approximately 85% in resolution time. That is not a marginal improvement. That is a fundamental difference in approach. The third is enemy testimony. Brenner's post-war assessment, "We were not prepared for them not to care," is the clearest possible articulation of why Patton's response worked where negotiation would have failed. The SS prisoner culture had been built on the assumption that defiance would be met with engagement. Patton denied them the engagement. The psychology unraveled. The fourth is long-term. Patton's prisoner management philosophy was incorporated into U.S. Army doctrine on prisoner of war administration in the post-war period. The 1949 revision of Field Manual 1940, covering enemy prisoner of war operations, included language on compliance expectation standards that directly reflected lessons drawn from Third Army's 1944-1945 operations. The doctrine change was not credited publicly to Patton. It rarely is. but the fingerprints are unmistakable to anyone who reads the original. The German soldiers who refused to eat in March 1945 taught the American military something it has used ever since. The lesson cost them 6 hours of hunger. It cost the Americans 4 words. Erich Brenner was repatriated to Germany in September 1945. He returned to Hamburg, which was in the British occupation zone. He worked as a civil administrator and died in 1978. His U.S. Army intelligence file, declassified in 1994, is 8 pages long. The most frequently quoted passage is his assessment of why the food refusal collapsed. He said they were not prepared for not being watched. George Patton died on December 21, 1945, 12 days after a vehicle accident near Mannheim, Germany. He never wrote publicly about the Bad Kreuznach incident. His diary entry for March 23, 1945, the day of the standoff, contains one sentence about prisoner management. Germans in the cages are behaving. I do not negotiate with people who have already surrendered. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The principle embedded in those 4 words, then don't feed them, is not a military principle. It applies to every domain where collective defiance is performed for an audience that the defiant party assumes will engage. Remove the audience. Remove the engagement. Remove the wall the performance was designed to push against. The performance ends. It always ends. The deepest form of command, in war, in institutions, in any structure of organized human effort, is not the ability to force compliance. It is the ability to make defiance pointless. Pointless defiance does not need to be punished. It defeats itself.